Hey everyone, welcome back to Ben Has Hobbies. In my last two videos I showed you a lot about my new game Innocence, and there are some exciting news about Innocence because there's a whole new faction on the horizon, the Eternal Flesh. I built this little Rubik's guy and 2 leaders already, and to make the Eternal Flesh we need a flesh recipe. And I got my recipe from the eternal and talented Unwantedleg. In my opinion, one of the most talented and most interesting miniature makers in our hobby. And no matter if you play Warhammer or Turnip28 or Trench Crusade, you need a good recipe for gore, blood, guts, all that good stuff. And so I want to make some more soldiers for the Eternal Flesh and show you my flesh recipe and how I build more miniatures for Innocence.
As a base for our fleshy riders, I'm using these Yulin German riders from the Great War Miniatures range. They are out of metal, but for our purposes they will be pretty easy to convert. The first thing we're gonna do is getting rid of all the heads. Of course we want to have some cubey fleshy ones for these riders, and I want as little facial features as possible from these horses. I will add some milliput and some paste to them, but I don't want any eye holes or ears to stick out. So I'm getting rid of most of that, and just like that we have some horseless riders with faceless horses, and all that's left to do to get them ready to convert them is giving them the arms, and luckily I didn't have to pin any of those. These metal miniatures went together pretty easily and no arms fell off this far. So now we're getting out the milliput, our trusty 2-part epoxy, and I'm just mixing 50-50 the gray and the yellow stuff to get some smooth milliput to make our heads out of and to fill some holes in the miniatures. To get the cubes, I'm just making cube-like shapes with my fingers. It doesn't have to be perfect, and I'm just smushing them on and getting them roughly into a cubey shape. Since we're gonna apply some paste in a future step, it's not that important that they are perfect, but I clean it up with my hobby knife a bit just to define the shape a bit more. If you want some real sharp cubes, I have a tutorial in my other Innocence video about making cubes out of UV resin with blue stuff molds, and then you get some really sharp cubes. So I'm just poking around here, defining the faces a bit more and making them a bit more eerie looking, so that the paste that I'm adding later will have a good base to hold on to. And you could go really nuts here and make some crazy heads, but I like to keep my builds pretty simple and easy. And now we're gonna add some fleshy texture with my trusty corrosion texture. This is a very fine paste, so it's not as rough as the mud I'm using for the bases, and this is good for all kinds of, well, organic shapes. I'm just adding that texture to all the faces of the horses and the riders and blending it into the rest of the body a bit more on the horses, and with that it's almost done. Just some mud on the bases, whatever you have laying around, or you can do some more elaborate basing, of course, but I love the very minimalist aesthetic of just having plain brown mud bases, something I learned from making Turnip28 miniatures. And with that it's time for priming, and I thought to myself, well, I'm using the airbrush so much in my videos, so in this video I will use it not. not one time. It's a brush only paint job and 2 layers of the Vallejo primer brushed on. Works like a charm. You just have to poke it in a bit into the crevices and into all the details, and it is just as smooth as if you had used an airbrush or a rattle can. It takes more time, but it works just as well. Now we're gonna apply some gray tones. We're going from dark to light, and I'm applying all those with my makeup brushes. Just an overbrush with the first one, so this one I'm going up and down with the brush, and with each future lighter tone I'm covering less and less of the miniature and just going from up to down so that I just get all the higher and more exposed parts of the miniature. And by going slowly and being a bit careful, we get a real nice transition from light to dark and really define all those nice details, really bring out the sculpt of the miniatures. And to blend all those dry brushes together, I'm using some Nuln oil, and this brings some great depth to the miniature. It adds some darkness to the shadows while smoothing out the transitions of all the different gray tones and knock back some of the sharkiness of the dry brushing. Now I'm just using some dried bark, unmixed, straight out of the bottle, to get some brown on the base. A very meditative step, I'd say. I always like to paint big things with one color. Then a small dry brush of a slightly warmer and lighter brown, just to get some of the texture paste highlighted. But to be honest, if you skip that step, you wouldn't miss too much, because now we're gonna drown the base in Agrex Earthshade. Of course, shaking it up and being generous with it on the whole base, but of course we don't want any pooling. You can see here I applied too much, so I just wipe some of the excess into a paper towel, soak it up with my brush to get an even layer on our lovely muddy bases. With that, we laid our groundwork on the miniature, and now the fun part begins. I'm using my beloved scale color, the pink flesh, to paint the fleshy parts, and this will be our base paint. And if you do half of the recipe, you will get a lovely color for brainy stuff, but we want to have it bloody, so we're applying a good base coat on everything. We want to be gory, and after 2 layers I'm using a bit of white just to highlight the cube a bit, to get a bit of the texture out, just as we did on the base. Maybe it's not entirely necessary, because we're gonna drown it again in a very watered down mix of Blood Angels contrast color mixed with Lamy medium and water. It's 1 drop red in like 20 drops of medium and water. It's very watered down. We just want to get it on there to get some depth and some shadows in there. And now comes the special part. This is the unwantedleg special. We're gonna use these Tamiya colors. They are acrylics, but they are very toxic, because I think there's some epoxy stuff in there, some liquid epoxy. It gets real hard and real shiny, and I'm very careful on the amounts that I'm mixing in. I'm using 3 parts red to 1 part black to get it a bit darker, and you don't need to apply much. I just apply a very thin layer to it. It takes a good while to dry, like a couple of hours, and I found that if I use my hair dryer, it doesn't work as good as it does with regular acrylic paints. I don't know why that is. I'm not a chemist, Maybe Goops from Goobertown Hobbies can answer that question, but I'm applying a second layer just on the parts that are a bit more in the shadows to make the color a bit more rich, and I used a tad more black for that second layer. One more step is left to really emphasize the gloss of the Gore parts. I'm using some ultra matte varnish from AK on all the black and gray parts to really get the contrast between an ultra matte body and those glossy heads, and that's an effect I really love, and I'm using the brush again. I think it would be very hard to use the airbrush here, and it worked like a charm. I really love the contrast between the matte parts and the glossy parts, and we get a very eerie look on our riders. But the most important step, of course, is making the rims black. Never forget to blacken dye rim, because it can make the difference between a good and a great miniature. And with that, the bloody riders are ready to get close and personal in Innocence.
Making cavalry is always fun, but I had a real blast doing these ones. The Great War minis were easy to convert into Eternal Flesh bloody cavalry, and I think they look pretty cool and gruesome. Thank you again to unwantedleg for that recipe. The flesh looks pretty good, I think. His is still a bit better, but it's his secret formula, so that is alright with me. I'm very happy with these. And I'm very happy about your continued support, watching my videos, commenting, sharing, hitting like. So thank you very much for that, and special thanks go out to my patrons on patreon.com. Thank you for your continued support. You really motivate me to tackle new projects and go on with the ones I currently have, like making Innocence. And now that we have a second army, well, almost, I still have to build some infantry. But when I'm done, we're gonna have 2 armies, and then we're gonna have ourselves a little battle report. So I'm looking forward to that very much. But until then, I was Ben, you were watching Ben Has Hobbies. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.